All right. Well, welcome back to The Young Idealist, my channel on German idealism and German romanticism. Today, I have a very special guest. I have Rolf Goebel, who is a distinguished professor of German, emeritus at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. I'm very excited to have Rolf here to discuss Hölderlins, poetry, thought, and philosophy. Just some background on Rolf. He has research interests are in German modernism, literary theory, cultural studies, sound studies, music, philosophy, literary aesthetics, also Walter Benjamin, of course, Friedrich Hölderlin, Franz Kafka, Thomas Mann, Rainer Maria Rilke. So Rolf, thank you very much for being here today. How are you doing?
Yeah, thank you for the kind invitation. This is going to be great. I'm always in for, promoting Hölderlin among, not just literary scholars, but philosophers. And because, thanks for the invitation.
Well, thank you for being here. So my first introduction to Hölderlin's thought was through Heidegger. Mm-hmm. But after that, I was introduced to how important Hölderlin was in regards to both Schelling and Hegel and Tübingen and the Tübingen Stift, and also through thinkers like Manfred Frank and Andrew Bowie. And I realized that it was actually Hölderlin that helped both Hegel and Schelling move slowly away from Fichte's kind of subjective idealism. But before we jump into all this fun stuff, maybe you could tell us who Hölderlin was, the period that he was working in and living in, and why Hölderlin means so much to you as a poet, thinker, and philosopher.
Yeah, so Hölderlin was born in 1770 and died in 1843. So his life spans sort of what I think is the peak of German idealism. And early on, his mother wanted him to become a minister in the Lutheran Church. But Hölderlin, like some of his friends, thought that was way too confining and too conventional. And he wanted to be, quite early on, a freelance writer, freelance poet. But he went through the regular schooling towards a possible career as a pastor. And then, as you mentioned, very importantly, he ended up in the Stift, the Protestant seminary in Tübingen, which is a beautiful, smaller city in southwest Germany on the River Neckar. And I'm actually going to visit Tübingen for 2 days next month or so, just to take in the atmosphere again. So Tübingen had a very notable seminary. And Hölderlin found himself roommating with Hegel and Schelling. Hegel was his own age, and Schelling was, I think, 5 years younger. And Schelling was the Wunderknabe of his time. I mean, he was already intellectually brilliant at age 15. And so he got early admission into this quite prestigious seminary. And so those three guys, they lived under very harsh circumstances, but cultivated this sort of extremely promising intellectual friendship. And for me, this is sort of, I mean, it's not the founding moment of German idealism, certainly not, but it is sort of one peak period in the late 18th century. And then Hölderlin, realized early on that because he was so extraordinary as a poet, that he found himself intellectually and in a material, financial sense, the outsider. And his mother said, well, I've told you, why don't you become a German minister? And her lady said, no, this is too conventional. This is too confining. And then, like Hegel, Hölderlin had at least 3 positions as a private tutor at prominent families, sort of like homeschooling, as we would call it. And that did not work out for various reasons. One reason, that when he was employed at the Frankfurt prominent banker's family, Gontard, he fell in love with Suzette Gontard, the wife of the banker, knowing, and mutual. I mean, she was also head over heels in love with him. And it's interesting that both knew from the beginning that this wouldn't go anywhere. I mean, she was married to a very prominent Frankfurt banker. They had children, and scholars speculate that this, meaning this extremely intense erotic and intellectual love, knowing that this would never work out, that this is part of Hölderlin's notion of desire, meaning that there is something in at least outstanding minds like Hölderlin where we cultivate a desire and we thrive on a desire, erotic, intellectually, whatever it is, knowing that the desire cannot be fulfilled, at least not in happy terms, in successful terms. And that tension between this irresistible desire towards something and knowing rationally that there is no way that this desire can be successfully fulfilled, that promotes, that is the dynamic of the desire itself. And that transcends, we can talk about this in details, that sort of tension of desire is central to an understanding of Hölderlin, and maybe also, and you are better familiar with the 2 philosophers, Hegel and Schelling, but certainly for Hölderlin. This is absolutely central, and you could trace it, and scholars have traced it, throughout his poetic vision, his poetological reflections, and so on and so forth. Anyway, so, he had to leave, obviously, the household of the Gontard family. Then afterwards, he met with Suzette secretly. Again, they met, but secretly, right? I mean, it is always the desire and the futile notion that this desire doesn't go anywhere. And then he had another position as a Hauslehrer, as a private tutor in Bordeaux in France, southern France. And he made an arduous journey on foot and stayed there for, I think, 3 months. And we don't know what happened. He seemed to like it there, and the consul where he was employed liked his services. But after 3 or so months, Hölderlin shows up again in his Swabian homelands, totally deranged. I mean, in rags. People barely noticed him. And that was not the beginning, but the first outbreak of his psychological condition. And I'm calling it a psychological condition because scholars, literary scholars, psychologists, psychoanalysts, what have you, we have never come to an agreement whether Hölderlin's psychological condition was a clinical disorder, bipolar, depression, even paranoid schizophrenia, or whether Hölderlin, noticing that, you know, his life as a freelance poet doesn't go anywhere, and, you know, he can't even successfully keep these tutorial positions, that Hölderlin performed this kind of insanity deliberately and intentionally as a protective shield between himself and society and the world. And this is fascinating, and this is also extremely central, because as literary scholars, of course, we have learned, and as philosophers, not to equate the biological facts with the thought and texts of these philosophers and poets, because texts take on a life of their own and do not necessarily directly reflect the intentions and inner beings of the authors. But in the case of Hölderlin, this is fascinating because it is, again, this ambiguity that I sketched for the notion of desire, because we still have no idea whether this was a genuine mental illness or a performance, or, as I think, it was both. There are really clear indications, even when Hölderlin was quite young, that he was given to rage and outbursts. And of course, he was frustrated. He tried to get recognition by Goethe and Schiller promoted him, published some poems and this important fragment of Hyperion for the first version of the later novel. Goethe had no understanding whatsoever and really no interest in him, and sort of patronizingly gave him some ill-guided advice how to write, you know, idyllic poetry. So Hölderlin from the beginning realized that he was, you know, a total outsider. Politically, he sympathized with the French Revolution. Poetically, because he would not write in the established style of, for example, Schiller and Goethe. Philosophically, again, he was in critical, partial agreement with Hegel and Schelling. So he was very, very concerned about his own social, political, poetological, and sort of emotional position in the world. And if you have that inborn realization that whatever you are trying to do as a poet, as a, you know, that you would not fit in, this may or may not have triggered an early onset of, you know, depression, bipolar. And I am not a psychologist. I'm just repeating certain speculations. So yes, he was given to mental instability, if you want to call it this way, and anxiety and what have you. But the way he developed is quite performative. And so what happened was, after 2 or so years back home, his mother and his friends decided, look, I mean, we can't really take care of this guy any longer. Right? I mean, he's given to these uncontrollable rages and these crazy ideas. So they gave him to a clinic run by a medical doctor, Autenried, who was one of the first, what we would nowadays call psychiatrists. And he thought that Hölderlin was most likely incurably ill with mental disease. He tried to work on him with the strategies that were available to the very sort of nascent psychology and psychiatry at that time, only to see that, you know, he couldn't do anything for Hölderlin. And by chance, Hölderlin meets a joiner, a carpenter, properly named Zimmer. Zimmermann in German is the older term for a carpenter or a joiner, a builder. And Zimmer had a house in Tübingen, right on the River Neckar, with a tower-like annex, with a wonderful roundish-shaped room upstairs. And Zimmer had read some of Hölderlin's poetry and loved it. And said, I mean, I am going to take this guy in as a lodger. And Hölderlin had some independent money inherited from his father or stepfather. And so Zimmer accepted a very modest monthly fee for room and board and care. And Hölderlin spent 36 years from 1807 to 1843. 36 years in this tower, seeing very few people. Some friends visited him, and Hölderlin led an extremely regulated life, getting up quite early, taking some walks, and played the piano. He had access to a small piano, and he would improvise in an obsessive way, always the same kind of small motivic unit, which he would repeat and vary ad infinitum. Early on, he had learned the flute, and then he found himself having access to this piano. And I mentioned this because we can also talk about this once we get to the texts, that Hölderlin is the musical poet #1 at that time. No one, or for nobody else, including all the later romantics and so on, for no one else is music and sound, the nature sound and so on, so absolutely central than for Hölderlin. And when he received some visitors, he would perform an almost parodistic show of deference and politeness. So he would bow in the older aristocratic form, which of course was anachronistic even by his time. He would address them by fictitious titles, Your Honor, Your Majesty. These were just other writers and friends. And he would unleash this torrent of free associative speech where he would jump from one topic to the next. And so the other guys could never, say anything much until they asked him to write a poem. And Hölderlin says, sure, give me a topic. So they said, autumn or summer or spring. And Hölderlin says, sure. He gets to his lectern and he writes, always in very similar rhythmic and strophic form, 2 or 3 stanzas, 4 lines each, in absolutely immaculate style. This is important because we will need to talk about his late poetry, which is so modern because Hölderlin, under the influence of Pindar and others, breaks up the German syntax, which is fully intact in poetry by Goethe and Schiller and the other contemporaries. He breaks it up into montage-like fragmentary sentences. And so his late poetry, and this is sort of the poetry 1802 to 1806, that poetry reads like a modernist collage of the 19-teens, 1920s, almost like a surrealist montage, because he takes up all kinds of fragments, mythological illusions, philosophical statements, radical images which he sort of juxtaposes without fusing them. So he totally undermines the then standard notion of the autonomy, self-sustained autonomy of the poetic artifact, to an extent that the first critic editors thought this is just unpublished. This is just the crazy outpourings of an insane guy. So we'll focus on the much more conventional middle and early periods. But this is just until around First World War, a young German scholar, Norbert von Hellingrath, discovers that late poetry and says, this is just the greatest stuff ever. And he initiated the first critical edition. He only managed to publish volume number 4, with the most important poetry until Hellingrath fell as a soldier before Verdun in World War I. But ever since that late poetry, this sort of collage-like assembly is considered the center of his own work and one of the greatest achievements of German classical romantic poetry. Back to the latest, so-called latest poetry in the Tower in Tübingen, which is totally different. It is totally uniform, totally accurate in terms of syntax, no longer this sort of associative collage effect, spontaneously written and no revisions. All the earlier poetry, especially this late poetry, is a palimpsestic piling up of infinite revisions and versions, and the critical edition, the so-called Frankfurt edition, publishes the facsimiles of that poetry on the left side of folio-sized volumes and a literal transcription in different fonts of the various stages and layers, right? But the late poetry has almost no revisions. It is absolutely perfect, but whereas the collage poetry is highly subjective. I mean, you hear the poet and philosopher Hölderlin in every second line. In the latest poetry, this is totally desubjectivized. There's no subjective voice whatsoever. And that explains why that late poetry was no longer signed with Hölderlin, but with fictitious names like Scardanelli and others, and fake dates. He died in 1843, but some poets are dated, I don't know, 30th of April, 1869 or so. Right? And so he says, yeah, okay, I'll do it, da, 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 da. And in 3 minutes, he writes this absolutely, I mean, formally perfect poem. And it's quite beautiful. I mean, it sort of gives a serene outlook on the landscape, on nature during the spring or fall. And then he died at the age of, 73, quite peacefully. And that's the end of his life.
It's funny. I was reading a biography on Schelling's life by Bruce Matthews, and apparently Joseph Schelling knew Hölderlin and asked Hölderlin to be a kind of chaperone to the young Schelling, because apparently Schelling was picked on a lot because he had a kind of big mouth and he was scrawny, but Hölderlin could hold them at bay. And another interesting thing that you brought up is that in 1803, I think Schelling was in Jena at the time, still lecturing. Hölderlin came to his door, as you described it, in rags, and Schelling didn't even recognize him, because Hegel had written letters to him saying, we have to be mindful of our friend. There's some, I've been hearing, stirrings from all over. So you gave me a lot of context with that. But you did a wonderful job of introducing Hölderlin. I just wanted to know what would you say are his main influences? What are his influences poetically, philosophically?
Yeah. The most important influences are from Greek antiquity. Pindar, Sophocles, Socrates to some extent. And then closer to his time, this sort of ecstatic poetry by Klopstock. But I always feel that Hölderlin very early on carved out such a, radically idiosyncratic voice that it's hard to trace down concrete influences. Scholars, especially scholars sort of, mid-20th century or so, have used all this wonderful philological toolbox to trace down Hölderlin's influences. Maybe temperamentally, I am not in that sense a strict philologist. So I can't really comment on these details. But yes, Hölderlin was extremely interested in the culture of what at that time, meaning 1800, German intellectuals and artists thought Greek antiquity was. And for me, that phantasma, and of course it is a phantasma, Hölderlin never went to Greece. But this phantasma, as a phantasma of an idealized ancient Greek antiquity, that has always been a major influence on Hölderlin, except and up until the latest period.
Yeah, when you were discussing the structure of his poetry, I saw connections with Novalis. Novalis also did not like system. He hated the whole systematic enterprise of philosophy and liked the idea of the free flowing of thought. But there was something that I wanted to ask you about. At this time, especially around Schelling, this idea of freedom and unity was so important. And I think, please correct me, I think Hölderlin also had an idea of what freedom and unity was. It had something to do with the kind of subject and the object and how we merge with the object, or could you maybe elaborate on some of these themes?
Yes, that is absolutely central. And I'm glad you bring up this point. And I'm going to turn to what I think is the best critical edition. I'm just putting it up here. It is, I don't know if that is visible. It is the so-called Münchner Ausgabe, the Munich edition, by Michael Knaub in 3 volumes. And it is a critical edition that preserves, of course, all the original spelling, a somewhat idiosyncratic spelling, and has at least some of the variants in the 3rd volume as the critical apparatus. So, Christopher, you're alluding at what I think is one of the most important short contributions to this question of the subject-object split and freedom and so on, that I know from that period. And maybe we can talk about this a little bit, because that bridges the gap between philosophy and poetry. And so later, so it's just a fragment that was found very late. And some critical editors have titled it Sein, Urteil, Modalität. So being with a capital B, like Heidegger's capital B, being, Urteil is judgment, and Modalität is of course modality. And Hölderlin, radical thinker as he was, the entire text in this edition is exactly a page and a few lines. He goes right away, as he always does in the high period, middle period. And I will just add one sentence cite in German, if I may, and then of course we'll continue this in English. Sein, and he writes it with a Y, like the late Heidegger writes being, no longer S-E-I-N, which is the usual spelling, but the archaic S-E-Y-N. And scholars speculate that Heidegger got this from Hölderlin. So Hölderlin, Sein, drückt die Verbindung des Subjekts und Objekts aus. Being expresses the connection of subject and object. And as we know, this was a question that haunts not just idealism with a capital I, but basically all Western metaphysics. What is the connection between the subject who sees, hears, smells, and cognizes the world, and the objects, which of course are not just inanimate objects, but the world? And Hölderlin is fascinated by this and says, okay, I'm giving you a radical answer on one page. And here goes. He says, Sein, being. And Heidegger has spent volumes of trying to define Sein as something that cannot be defined. Hölderlin says, I'm going to define it. It is the connection between subject and object, but in such a way that Sein schlechthin, Sein in its essence, is the perfect fusion of subject and object. So Sein is not, as later scholars would say, it is, let's say, the immersion of the subject in the world, sort of like Heidegger's Dasein. It's not the isolated, self-centered subject opposed to the objective world. It is an immersion, a living experience of the world. And Hölderlin says, well, that's too conventional for me. No, Sein, properly understood in its essence, schlechthin, absolutely, if you want to, is a unity of subject and object in such a way that no separation can even be attempted. And the faculty to recognize that absolute unity between subject and object is the intellektuelle Anschauung. And you got to help me translating this into English, because no one that I know has managed to translate it. It is sometimes
intellectual intuition, maybe?
Yeah, and that is the common term. And that works if we agree that intuition in this sense is not intuition in the common sense, oh, I intuitively grabbed ice cream, not salad, because spontaneously I just wanted ice cream, right? Or this intuitive display of affects and emotion. No, intuition, okay, if Anschauung comes from a German word schauen, which is the more holistic synonym for sehen. Sehen is more the optical sense, and schauen is the more integrated perception or apperception of predominantly the visual world, because schauen means to visualize. But it's not just visualization. It is, in that sense, an intuitive, direct, immediate cognition or perception of something. So it is not a purely rational, analytical view of reality that, for example, a natural scientist would have to practice. So the Anschauung of, for example, water is not, well, it's H2O. That's not Anschauung, that's analysis, right? It is maybe closer to what a devout Catholic perceives in water if she enters a church and realizes that in that vessel is not just H2O, but it is the holy water, right? It has been blessed by the priest. So this is the intellect, but it's intellectual. So it's related to the intellect. It's not purely intuitive in that sense. And maybe not, yeah.
When you were talking, I'm getting, views of Schelling's system of transcendental idealism, because intellectual intuition for Schelling is not what you say either. It's not this rational cognition. It has to do with this idea of absolute production and product, and this kind of merging of ideal and real in our understanding, right? So it's not this kind of Kantian, the world conforming to our faculties. There's something more ontological based there, but also, like you said, the ability to grasp, right? Grasp hold of something's essence. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah, that's a good term, grasping, right? The way I grasp a physical object. So for me, the intellektuelle Anschauung grasps reality. It's not just a distant, disinterested visualization, but it grasps it. And Hölderlin is interested in that because he wants to come to terms with the notion of identity, which again haunts idealism and lots of philosophers before. And he indirectly alludes to someone who he was extremely critical of, the famous philosopher Fichte. And Hölderlin claims that for Fichte, identity is when someone says, ich bin ich. So if I say, Rolf is Rolf, ich bin ich, then that expresses my identity and it assures me that I have an identity. And Hölderlin says, well, wait a moment. As soon as I talk about ich, about I am no longer totally identical with the second I in the sentence, ich bin ich, I am I. And one could argue, well, then don't be self-conscious. But then, of course, Hölderlin would imply, at least, then I don't have any identity, right? So as soon as I'm thinking about what my identity may be, I need to say I, and at least according to Hölderlin, Fichte claims, yeah, I is I. I is not Christopher and whatever. So Hölderlin says that's the problem. As soon as I even say I am I, even if I begin just to think, who am I? I'm already splitting off. I'm already splitting myself into the first I, ich, and the second I, bin ich. And Hölderlin says, how can I say I without self-consciousness? How is self-consciousness possible? Only if I oppose myself to myself, if I separate myself from myself, but nonetheless recognize myself in that other that I have just separated from myself. Right? And this is Hölderlin's solution between this undefined ich bin ich kind of identity, which I wouldn't know, and the typical alienation or estrangement that occurs if I say, I'm adhering to the epistemological subject-object split. Here's the subject, there's the object. No, it's a third way. It's not a compromise. Hölderlin, of course, needless to say, was not into compromises. For him, compromises were no solution. Dialectics, yes, and he learned that from his roommate, Hegel. But it's a third way for me. And he says again, I only recognize whatever I might be by simultaneously opposing myself to myself, but not to a degree that I sort of fall apart, but that I still recognize myself as myself in that other that is different, but part of me. Yeah. So it's this kind of movement. And so it is not a synthesis in the dialectical sense. It is not that the first I in Ich bin ich is the thesis, the second Ich is the antithesis, and then my identity is the synthesis. No, for me, the way I understand it, it is sort of an oscillation between thesis, the first Ich, and the other Ich, back and forth. And in that back and forth, you have a dynamic, and that is my identity. My identity is always already dynamic, but of course also endangered. And Hölderlin constantly talks about the Abgrund where the humans are, the abyss in which I find myself, or on the edge of the abyss, right? So this is his view of identity. Yeah, maybe so far, yeah.
I can see so much in that 100%. Not to bring this back to Schelling, I apologize, but you know, Schelling's very early essays, he makes the absolute ground the I, and then later on moves away from that, and you can see Hölderlin's you know, influence here. No, we can't just make the I the absolute, right? There's a whole world out there. There has to be this tension, as you described. Yeah. Which makes a lot more sense. So you're fleshing in other areas for me as well too. So yeah. And Hölderlin as well too.
Yeah. And that is so important. That's why I'm glad you brought up this question at the beginning, because this kind of dynamic you find in other of Hölderlin's main themes, which we maybe can also talk about. For example, the role of the poet. To simplify a little bit and not be quite fair, but Schiller and Goethe were, of course, the established poets of their times. I mean, Goethe, needless to say, was able to unite, you know, politics and art and writing, of course, and Schiller united poetry and philosophy and so on and so forth, but they were really established. Hölderlin, as I said, was not just not established, but not the inability, it's not a moralistic thing, the impossibility of being established as the one he was at that time. That is part of who he is. And so he was keenly interested in reflecting in his poetry on the role of the poet himself in this sort of self-referential way. And Heidegger was extremely interested in this. And for Hölderlin, the poet, typically Hölderlin, inhabits a very unstable in-between position between the world and the humans, or the other humans, of course, and the spiritual or divine world. And the lower level is the world of 1800, with all its political turmoils and fertile philosophies and what have you, art. And the world above is much more complicated, because Hölderlin felt that with the crucifixion of Christ Jesus, a Götterdämmerung, to quote Wagner, the night of the gods began. Because for him, Hölderlin, Jesus was the last of the gods of the antiquity. In fact, for him, Hölderlin, Jesus was the successor, or almost the contemporary, of Dionysus. Of course, the god of music, the god of rapture, of excess, of ecstasy. And so he thought, with the crucifixion and then ascent to heaven of Jesus, the age of the gods had come to an end, to a provisionary end, and the night of the godlessness begins. And the poet, as I said, inhabits this very unstable in-between position between that sphere of the vanished gods and the here and now of the humans. So, of course, the poet is fully human. So Hölderlin was not, in that sense, sort of, thinking of the poet as a quasi-deity. No, no, no. I mean, the poet is simultaneously both totally human and worldly, but because of his poetic vision, can intimate something about and of the gods in their vanished infinite distance. And so the poet mediates between the gods and the humans in his poetry. And that's why much of his poetry deals with nature, where, for example, thunder is the sonic reflection of the lightning, and the lightning, of course, is Zeus's zigzag staff. And for him, typically classical romantic, the nature is filled with spirit, with a divine or otherwise spirituality. And the medium in which the poet conveys that divinity, or that absence of divinity, which is indirectly still reflected in the spirituality of nature, that medium is, of course, in a material sense, the written manuscripts of his poetry that are reproduced by facsimile in the Frankfurt edition.
So the poet is, in a sense, the modern Hermes between the divine.
Exactly.
And yeah.
The hermeneut between
yes.
the above and the here. Yes. But it's fascinating that Hölderlin very often talks about Schrift, and that is the script, the handwritten letter of a manuscript, or because he published something, the printed script. And he was constantly fussing about the font size and so on of his published works. But on a more, maybe on a more aesthetic level, it is not the written script, but Gesang and Saitenspiel, song or singing, and Saitenspiel is the play of a musical instrument that has strings, a lyre, a violin, whatever, right? As opposed to a flute or piano. And so I'm fascinated by the intersection and difference between Schrift, which again is the physical, the material handwritten letters on a piece of paper, and the Gesang, which manifests itself in that material Schrift, but is not identical with it. And Gesang is, of course, not just what we now call vocalization. I mean, it's not just spoken speech or singing. Gesang is a much more accomplishing musical articulation. For example, through written poetry. Okay. And the Saitenspiel refers both to the actual playing of physical instruments. There are clear indications that some people play something, and he calls it Saitenspiel. But Saitenspiel is also this more metaphoric or maybe metaphysical sounding and resounding of poetry and the world in the Schrift, in the scriptural materiality of a written page.
I recently watched a really good documentary on Kandinsky, and Kandinsky had a kind of synesthesia with colors. Mm-hmm. Colors had a sound to it. Does Hölderlin also use this kind of technique that you were describing with words? Is there a kind of sound element to the prose or poesy?
Yes, to an extent that his poetry and even his prose, his philosophical essays, are extremely musical. Maybe similar to, and you know, we talked about this, is that my knowledge of Schelling is pitifully deficient, but I read some of Schelling, and I was struck, in addition to the profundity of the ideas, by the musicality and the rhythmic sensuousness of his prose, as opposed to, if I may say this, to the prose of the third roommate, that is philosophically very profound, but not sensuous and certainly not musical at all. And Hegel's understanding of music is notoriously, shall we say, different. But back to Hölderlin, his prose is supremely musical in the sense that he paid very close attention to the syntactic rhythm, to the sensuousness of these far-fetched metaphors. Very often he combines different words into one, and he writes it without space, like in one famous poem, Hälfte des Lebens, half time of life, the heilig nüchterne Wasser, the holy sober, in one word, the holy sober waters, right? So two seeming opposites forged into one. So his prose and his poetry are in a way as polyphonic and also montage-like in their fragmentary juxtapositions as his direct contemporary Beethoven. Beethoven was also born in 1770. They didn't know each other, but Hölderlin's late poetry, the Turm, the tower poetry, this totally impersonal poetry, has some similarity to Beethoven's very last compositions, especially the second set of the Bagatelles, where you feel that they are much more desubjectivized than what I think corresponds to Hölderlin's high period, 1802 or 1806 or so, of this fragmentary collage perfect. That very directly corresponds to Beethoven's late string quartets, that also are just, you know, mixing and juxtaposing rapidly different musical idioms in a very, very sort of collage-like technique that you find in Hölderlin's poetry. And this is fascinating because it establishes, and I have written a little bit about this in an essay, this establishes an intermedial discourse around that time between two geniuses, genius not in this in this sort of sentimental way, but genius in the sense of incommensurable creativity, that you find most radically realized in Beethoven, who was also an outsider and given to, psychological conflicts and so on, and of course Hölderlin.
Well, thank you for that. I'm thinking maybe we should, if we still have time, if you're okay with time, we could merge to some of the poems that we were going to look at and maybe discuss some of them. Normally what I do on my channel is I'm very hermeneutical when it comes to texts. And I like making people comfortable with the text. So reading through the text and digesting it, ruminating on it. It's always a wonderful thing to do. So did you want to start off with To the Fates, or do you have do you have a favorite one that you'd like to start with?
Yeah, maybe An die Parzen, to the Muses, or which one? I didn't quite catch it.
An die Parzen, yeah.
Yeah, okay, right. Let me just find it in my edition here. I'm using the very nice one-volume edition by Jochen Schmidt. 97.
Unfortunately, I have the Penguin.
It's in the Penguin. Okay. Why don't we do this? Because it's very short. If we have time, I'll just read these 4 stanzas in German, and you read them in English from the translation.
Sounds great. I like that.
Because then we can hear the beauty. An die Parzen. So this is from the earlier period between 1796 and 98. An die Parzen. Nur einen Sommer gönnt ihr Gewaltigen und einen Herbst zu reifem Gesange mir, dass williger mein Herz vom süßen Spiele gesättiget, dann mir sterbe. Die Seele, der im Leben ihr göttlich Recht nicht wahrt, sie ruht auch drunten im Orkus nicht. Doch ist mir einst das Heilge, das am Herzen mir liegt, das Gedicht gelungen. Willkommen dann, o Stille der Schattenwelt. Zufrieden bin ich, wenn auch mein Saitenspiel mich nicht hinabgeleitet. Einmal lebt ich wie Götter und mehr bedarf's nicht.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. So, To the Fates. One summer only grant me, you powerful fates, and one more autumn only for mellow song, so that more willingly replete with music's late sweetness, my heart may die then. The soul in life denied its God-given right, down there in Orcus also will find no peace. But when what's holy dear to me, the poem's accomplished, my art perfected, then welcome silence, welcome cold world of shades. I'll be content, though here I must leave my lyre, and songless travel down. For once I lived like the gods, and no more is needed. Gorgeous.
Yeah. One of the central poetological self-reflective poems.
So I mean, the poetry that I'm accustomed to is Coleridge and Keats and Wordsworth, but I've tried to go through these pieces today and tried to figure out what's going on. So maybe you can help us take us through the you can do the German if it's easier, some of the imagery that he's discussing here. Yeah. If that's okay.
Yeah. No, that's a good approach. So it's interesting that in this poem and in other poems, he addresses someone. Sometimes his friends, an Eduard, one of his friends. Here he addresses the fates or the muses directly, an die Parzen. He wants to have a dialogue with these divine forces. Right? So it's almost like he writes a letter, right? And he says, basically, just give me one summer. And actually, if you want to, just give me one autumn. And if you grant me that one short evanescent moment, I can use that for reifen Gesang, for my mature Gesang, the way I defined it as the poetic output, the poetic production. And if you do that, if you grant me just one autumn and grant me the inspiration to write mature poetry, then I'm willing to die. Then you know, you can have me. And he says, why? Because in the second stanza, my soul was not granted a divine or divinely sanctioned right in life. Meaning I've always felt lost and alienated and desperate. And that means once I go into the underworld, into the orcus, well, I will still be lost, or particularly lost, but I've been lost in life all my years. And again, he is sort of around 26, 27, 28. But he says, that's perfectly fine. I accept it. If you grant me that one autumn where I can not just write mature poetry, but also cultivate this heilige, this sacred, holy impetus that I have always felt, not just as a poet, but as a human being. Because if you do this, if you let me write mature poetry that has this sort of holy or sacred core, then not just this particular poem, but poetry itself, das Gedicht, has succeeded. Then I am a successful poet. And then he says, welcome, O you silence of the underworld, the shadow, the world of shadows. I'll be quite happy. Even, and here comes again the central Saitenspiel, even if I can't take my Saitenspiel with me. And again, the Saitenspiel is not here the literal lyre, because he didn't play the lyre as far as I know. He played the traverse flute and the piano. No, it's not a particular instrument, but it is the musical creativity, the musical intuition that has informed all of his poetry. So don't worry, you know, if I can't take all of this into the shadow world, that's fine, because you have already just granted me that one autumn of sort of kairos, of kairotic perfection. And because that has happened, I will go into the amusical world of the shadows, the underworld, because once, thanks to you, I have lived like the gods. I have not become a god. Hölderlin always emphasizes that he is not a divine poet or so. He's more than human. But if you grant me that one autumn, and if I maybe write just one single poem, maybe this one here, then I have had a fulfilled life, because I have lived like gods, wie Götter, and mehr bedarf's nicht. I don't need anything more. End of the poem.
I was actually taking notes while you were discussing. This is fantastic. This is amazing. Thank you so much. You really painted a very nice picture of Hölderlin. Like the one thing I'm happy about our discussion so far is that other people that watch this get to see this and are able to then pick up the poem and go through it and see this beautiful imagery, this musical kind of imagery.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And you really bring it to life. You really bring it to life when you read it. There's a passion in your voice that I love. It's fantastic.
Yeah. No, I mean, I am passionate about Hölderlin, and maybe as a footnote, I have spent much of my scholarly career on Kafka, and I find him intellectually absolutely fascinating. I mean, I've spent many years working and thinking about Kafka, but I'm not passionate about Kafka because he's much more ironic, he's much more distant. I would be faking it if I said I'm passionate about Kafka. I've never been passionate about Kafka, but I'm passionate about Hölderlin because of this, this beautiful musicality of his poetry and actually of his written prose, the novel Hyperion, and yeah.
Did Hölderlin influence other German poets, Stefan George, maybe Rainer Maria Rilke?
Yes, that is also important, and maybe we can go a little bit into the afterlife. So again, Hölderlin was not unknown during his lifetime. I mean, he published Hyperion, one of the most substantial novels of that time. He published some poetry in sort of journals, and even during his lifetime, some of his friends began to plan a first edition of the best of Hölderlin. And that, was stalled and then rekindled and so on and so forth. But so Hölderlin was not totally unknown during his lifetime. But around 1900, that's when the total upsurge of Hölderlin's legacy kicked in. So with a delay of very roughly speaking, 60 years, okay. And again, it began with some fellow poets who then published at least one more edition later on. And then again, with this enormous project of the first critical edition under Norbert von Hellinger, the young guy who very sadly died at the front at Verdun. And at the same time, around 1890s, maybe 1880s, Hölderlin, maybe even before, I'm getting a little bit shaky here on my dates, composers like Brahms set Hölderlins Schicksalslied to music. And you mentioned very important early modernists and classical modernists like Rainer Maria Rilke, who wrote an extremely difficult and exciting poem to Hölderlin, on Hölderlin, so an homage to Hölderlin. Stefan George, at that time, meaning very roughly speaking, around 1900, and the first decades before and after, Stefan George saw himself as a visionary poet and thought that Hölderlin was his direct ancestor in that sense. Because George was not quite wrong, as I alluded to, Hölderlin himself saw himself as totally human, and maybe sadly more than human, but saw himself as this hermeneut for the world of vanished gods above. And George takes that one decisive step further and says, I am the prophet of a total renewal of German culture, away from the late 19th century materialism and industrialism and what Heidegger criticizes as the quantitative technological age. George said, this is just the end of intellectual and aesthetic civilization. And George was inspired by Hölderlin to revive a poetic vision of a new Germany, based not, as it was in Hölderlin's time, on endless wars and famine and disease and what have you, but on a new Vaterlandsliebe, on a constructive love of the homeland. And George tried to do this for Germany and called it das geheime Deutschland, the secret Germany, and an underlying intellectual, artistic, spiritual German that he tried to cultivate in his circle of friends. And I'm also fascinated by George because, if I also may add that footnote, I am a distant great nephew or whatever of one of the outer members, one of the members of the outer George circle. There was the inner circle of extremely close friends, and then there were two outer circles, and a professor of philosophy at Kiel University, Kurt Hildebrandt, belonged to this outer circle. And I remember him as this serene, extremely dignified, elderly gentleman who owned the house where my grandmother lived. And that inspired me, not just as a scholar, and I was 6 or so, I was a small boy, but I have never forgotten that image. And later on, people told me that, yes, he belonged to the George cycle, and he had a very, very shady career. He was an opportunistic Nazi to get himself appointed to a vacancy at the philosophy department at Kiel University that had been vacated because a, in big unquotes, half-Jewish professor had been kicked out by the Nazis. So Hildebrandt is extremely controversial, but he wrote a very interesting, if arch-nationalistic book on Hölderlin. And I'm mentioning all of this not to promote me here, it's about Hölderlin and not about me, but I want to, give our viewers the idea that there are poets like Hölderlin, and to a very critical degree, George, that, literally change your life. And Rilke picks up on that. For Rilke, Hölderlin must have changed their life. And the same for the next generation, maybe the leading poet of the next generation, Paul Celan, who is best known for the Todesfuge, the fugue of death, his attempt to come to terms with the Holocaust and the concentration camps. And when you take a look at Celan's poetry, you feel both this sort of rhapsodic melodiousness that you find in Hölderlin. Todesfuge, of course, is a musical genre, the fugue of death, but also this extreme condensation and sparse elusiveness and elusiveness that Celan sort of dramatizes, radicalizes, and that he got at least indirectly from Hölderlin. So there's a long legacy of influences, at least in German poetry, beginning with the 1890s, and in music, again, interestingly enough, with people like Brahms and countless later composers, especially early 20th century to 1970s. The classical modern composers, and then the avant-garde composers of the Darmstadt school, Wolfgang Riem and others, who set mostly sort of fragments of Hölderlin to radically innovative music. And people have written books just about the musical reception of Hölderlin's poetry.
Amazing, amazing. Actually, I was thinking, this is one line from Stefan Georg. Sorry, I pronounced his name, George. He says, where word breaks off, no thing may be. Always is I always think about this these two lines. I don't want to take much more of your time, but I thought we could maybe end today with one more piece by Hölderlin, the autumn piece actually that I have here, if that's okay. The piece autumn.
Oh, yeah, okay. And now he wrote various autumn poems, and I can't recall which one I gave you.
You said the version in here was all right. So on 3, yeah. Autumn, nature's bright gleam, 337. Let me just see the. Yeah, der Herbst. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah. Does it begin something with the gleaming of nature is higher appearance?
Das Glanzen der Natur ist.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. So this is one of his very late poems from the latest period, from the Tower period. And shall we do we have time to do the double reading, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking about your time. I don't want to take too much time.
Christopher, my time is flexible. I kept the entire afternoon. It's how long Zoom lets us, and depending on your time. So don't worry.
Oh no, I'm fine. I'm completely fine.
Okay.
Let's do that. Let's do the German and the English. I like that.
Yeah. So it is one of the 4 or even 5 poems written on commission by his visitors on autumn. Der Herbst. Das Glänzen der Natur ist höheres Erscheinen, wo sich der Tag mit vielen Freuden endet. Es ist das Jahr, das sich mit Pracht vollendet, wo Früchte sich mit frohem Glanz vereinen. Das Erdenrund ist so geschmücket und selten lärmet der Schall durchs offene Feld, die Sonne wärmet, den Tag des Herbstes mild, die Felder stehen als eine Aussicht weit, die Lüfte wehen, die Zweig und Äste durch mit frohem Rauschen, wenn schon mit Leere sich die Felder dann vertauschen, der ganze Sinn des hellen Bildes lebet, als wie ein Bild, das goldene Pracht umschwebet. Den 15. November 1759.
Beautiful. Autumn. Nature's bright gleam is higher revelation, where amid many joys the day comes to its end. It is the year in glorious consummation, where fruit with cheerful brightness gleaming blend. Earth's globe is thus adorned with rare alarms. Of noise through open fields the sunshine warms. The day of autumn mildly fields lie so, that wildly they are viewed, the breezes blow. Through twigs and branches, rustling cheerfully, through then to emptiness the fields give way. The total meaning of this picture lives as might, a picture framed in glory, golden light. November 15th, 1759.
Yeah. What's your idea about this?
I always thought, I always thought he was, I always saw him kind of bringing ancient Greece back and placing it on Germany. So like the Ister becomes this kind of ancient flow back in and forward into the past, into the past, into the future. And there's a kind of it's a portal in a sense to both worlds. And the poet is the kind of mediator in between that can pull back from the past and bring forward and can see, beyond just the real hand. There's more, there's something dwelling interior.
Right.
Autumn for me, it's interesting. My youngest niece was asking me one day, I was telling her about the ancient Greek tale about Persephone being dragged down by Hades and Gaia dying because she misses her daughter. In a sense, autumn is kind of that, right? It's a merger into winter where nature kind of goes in, dormant. It doesn't, metaphorically die, but in a sense, it's concealed. It draws inward. And autumn is that point. It's the, you get a little bit of sort of warm weather, but not really, but you're reaching the end in a sense. I could be totally off here. I'm so sorry.
No. This is very good. I mean, you hinted at, the idea that Hölderlin in his, last 36 years, tried to develop this sort of serene view of nature that, as you correctly said, in his earlier years was sort of saturated with spirituality and the gods, the way he thought the ancient Greeks had conceived nature. Again, we are not in this scholarly paradigm of reconstructing Greek antiquity on its own terms. It is an 18th century phantasma where Hölderlin and others projected their concerns for their time around 1800, and especially their concerns for a better future, back onto antiquity. And so the idea was that Hölderlin says in antiquity, there was unity. The human subject was one with nature and the gods. In our Götternacht, in the night of the gods, meaning 1800, the present, those two spheres have totally fallen apart, and humans are isolated and desperate and desolate. But he says very clear in some of his poems and in Hyperion, what once was unified in Greek antiquity will be unified or reconciled again in the future. And that, of course, is a dialectical movement that he presumably learned from Hegel. And the assumption is the older unity in Greek antiquity was intuitive and spontaneous and natural. And the future is not the repetition of that unity, but it is a reconciliation, a coming together of what was separated during the night of the gods. And this may be, and I'm glad you brought this up, it hadn't really occurred to me that this scheme applies not just to his sort of high period, the late poetry, but also to the latest poetry. Although, and I think you mentioned that, for me at least, this nature has nothing to do with this divinely inspired nature that Hölderlin thought occurred in ancient Greece. It is this sort of totally serene, almost Zen Buddhistic suchness of nature, right? He just mentions, the gleaming of nature is a higher appearance or revelation, and the day ends with joy, and the year, as you said, comes peacefully to a close and all its splendor, and the earth is adorned, and even the fields resonate. Der Schall is sort of a resonant sound, and the sun warms. And so, so this is for me, this is a view of nature, and again, I'm glad you brought that up. That had not occurred to me. A view of nature that can maybe only understood in its contrast to this sort of dynamic, active view of nature that you have in Hyperion and so on and so forth, right? It is a serenity that has apparently passed through this unsuccessful revival of divinely inspired nature, hence this sort of impersonal serenity. And again, what we need to emphasize is that the mature poetry is highly subjective, highly personal, and so is Hyperion. And this is totally desubjectivized. There is no poetic I. On a literal sense, there is no ich. He never mentions, in some he does, but at least in this poem, he doesn't mention ich. he just describes nature the way a Zen Buddhist would ask us to open ourselves unconditionally to nature, without my subjective projections, without my concepts and my desires, and so on and so forth. Just let nature come to you. And I feel this is what he does. He had, this sort of roundish or semi-round room on the second or third floor of this tower, overlooking the beautiful River Neckar and the mountains behind it. So what he's describing is what he daily saw, but it's, again, totally desubjectivized in a positive way. Again, like Zen says, if you take in nature without interference of your subjectivity, that's not an efficient mode. That is the most open, productive way of taking the nature in on its terms, not on your individual terms.
Yeah, part of the early 1790s, early Schelling and even Hegel saw Cartesianism, as this mechanical system, that made nature this atomism. It's dead inside. Schelling actually calls it a spiritual sickness. So when I read some of these, it's not that he's trying to animalize, turn nature into some animal. He's trying to spiritualize it, give it back its life, right? Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, no, this is important. And here we don't have the young Hölderlin's attempt to define intellektuelle Anschauung as a perfect oneness of subject and object. This is not what it is. This is not even a oneness with nature. It is a self-revelation of nature, in admittedly Hölderlin's words, without the subject.
This may, I've always wanted to know, because I have suspicions, but the oldest systematic program of German idealism, for me, this piece, I posted it once on, on Twitter or Facebook, and multiple Hegelians private messaged me saying, "There's no Hegel in this." I agree. I think that was written primarily by Schelling and Hölderlin, especially with the whole, the rebirth of mythology, poetry, a new, the state can't be, the state can't exist because, the state is the idea of a state is mechanical. And so we have this kind of organic understanding. And so I really see the two voices there being Hölderlin and Schelling. Do you have any thoughts on this piece, or if not, that's okay.
No. I mean, this is one of the most important philosophical documents of that time. I think we can safely say that, right? I mean, it's very, very short, 3-5 pages in print.
Yes.
And it is, as you said, very enigmatic because we don't know exactly who authored it.
Right.
It is presumably in Hegel's handwriting.
Right.
But I agree with you that it doesn't have the analytical rationality that I find, at least in many of Hegel's texts.
Mm-hmm.
It is much more in terms of style and the thoughts that you mentioned, the revival of a new mythology, or maybe the creation of a new mythology that brings together, philosophy and poetry and real life. Anything that's around 1800 is falling apart, going its different ways. That's what those two guys, Schelling and Hölderlin, thought should be brought together, as did Friedrich Schlegel with his universal poetry, which is sort of a almost a radicalization of this idea. And the Romantics were also, of course, fascinated by the new mythology, a new way of coming to terms with the divine and life, basically, on poetic terms. And Hölderlin always said, well, I mean, I love you guys. I mean, you're the greatest philosophers. And, at least when we were roommates, I absolutely loved what you told me. Later on, they drifted apart, again, because of Hölderlin's serious personal problems. And then Schelling had his career, and Hegel had his very distinguished career in Berlin later on. But I felt always that Hölderlin highly respected what he learned from the two philosophers, but he was very self-confident. Hölderlin had never any doubts about his own creativity. He knew that he was basically a failure in terms of not getting published, getting no recognition, and what have you. But he had no doubts, as far as I can tell, about his own poetic potential. And he said, ultimately, at least I as a poet have to tell you guys and anyone else, ultimately it is poetry that can unite all these different spheres of life. Because poetry, like in my own Hölderlin, unites philosophical reflection, but in the language of poetic imagery, not the cold analytic imagery, language, discourse of, for example, Hegel, right? And so this may also explain why, those three guys sort of drifted apart. I mean, it is, they were literally united in Tübingen for, I think, 2 years of being roommates. And they had endless discussions. I mean, they drank and then they discussed and solved virtually all problems of the world, as one does when one is, 21 or so. Right? And Schelling was 15. But they drifted apart again for practical reasons. They had different jobs in different areas. But for me, their drifting apart is also a sign that, unfortunately and sadly, this sort of vision of unification in poetry and philosophy cannot be realized in real life. So poetry and philosophy drifted apart. Philosophy with Schelling and Hegel, and at least philosophical poetry with the isolated Hölderlin in his tower.
Well, thank you for that. That was amazing. I was just wondering about yourself. What about your own work right now? Are you working on anything new? Do you have anything coming out? I'll post all of your links when I post the video, so people can check out your work.
Well, I am awaiting the galley proofs of a companion to sound in German-speaking cultures, published by Camden House in the United States, Boydell and Brewer, England, and Camden House in this country. And I was very, very fortunate to assemble 17 scholars from this country, Germany, one is from Holland, who wrote short essays on the meaning of sound, music, and all kinds of other sounds for German culture in various periods. So wow. The first essay is on music in the Middle Ages. And the last essay, before the epilogue, the last essay is about sound in the digital age. And the other colleagues cover significant periods in between. And so that is coming out in, well, we have an official publication date. It's public, and so I can mention it, October 24th. knock on
Nice.
wood,
Congratulations.
that we get the proofreading done and that I have the energy of doing the index. But we'll get it done.
Well, congratulations on that. And I want to thank you so much for today and coming here and teaching all of us about who Hölderlin was, what his philosophy was, what his poetry is, giving us a whole background to him, really fleshing out all of his ideas. This is a wonderful conversation. One of my best, actually. This is one of my favorite interviews I've ever had, actually. So thank you so much for this.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this is very nice of you to say, and I really enjoyed it. I mean, you are so, so wonderful in posing questions and taking what I say and into the direction of philosophy, and so I think this is a very, very good format. I mean, this sort of works actually so better than someone giving a talk and then there's a Q&A. This sort of is much more improvisatory and lively, right? So
Yeah,
again, thank you very, very much for this opportunity.
No. It is my pleasure to have you here. Thank you. When I go through all of the multiple YouTube philosophy people, normally what happens is they'll post pictures and then have this kind of monotone voice explaining things. That to me is too scripted. It's too, cut in, cookie cutter. I like dialogue, and I also like, unscripted, bringing somebody in, especially because if I don't know Hölderlin and I don't know him as much as you do, I know him only a little this much, bringing in someone that knows him so well and that can bring him alive, and you brought Hölderlin completely alive. He was alive for an hour and a half, back again in the world.
Great.
Yeah.
The hour and a half went by very fast.
All right. Well, thank you so much for everything. And I'll be in touch. I should have the video up in a day or two, and I'll let you know.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, again, thanks so much.
No problem. Thank you.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.